For this video, I'm going to show Azure Bastion host, which is a service, and I'll talk about it later. But basically, let me set up the scenario. So usually, you have your client workstation or your workstation or whatever, and it wants to connect to a VM over here that's in a virtual network, and it has a public IP address, so that's how you connect to it. And you follow the normal network security group rules. But, a lot of companies or whatever, it's not good to have a public IP address, because in a lot of people it's a security risk. Maybe they want the VM to host an app that's only going to be used, internally in the network, and doesn't want it to be public, so they don't want to have a public IP address, only a private one. So by following the normal network security group rules to filter traffic through the public IP address isn't ideal. Like even if even when it's useful that you're trying to create RDP session to the virtual machine, so some alternatives are using a jump server, which I talked about in a different video, or an Azure Bastion service. And this service just allows you to connect to a virtual machine using your browser and the Azure portal. So I'll real quick explain what a jump server is, and then talk about why we could use Azure Bastion instead. Just normally this is what companies would do. So they'd set up a jump server. So they have their VM here that's hosting the application or the web server or database server or whatever services it's doing that it needs, and it has its private IP address, and that's it, and it's in its own subnet. And then there's another subnet that's another VM, and that's acting as a jump server, and that has a public IP address, and they're both part of the same virtual network. They're just in two different subnets. And so when a user wants to use the app that the VM is hosting here, but it's private, it can't just RDP to it because it's private. So it will RDP to the VM over here that has a public IP address, and then that'll direct it to this VM. So it's acting as like a middleman. That's what the jump server is doing. So the jump server has open public IP address, and the other one doesn't. So that's what a jump server does. It just provides like additional layer of security. So that's what a jump server does, but you have to manage that and set it all up. And so what's better about Azure Bastion is all you have to do, it's a managed service. So Azure just manages it. You don't have to worry about it. So instead of having two VMs, you just have your VM with the app or the web server or whatever else that you want it to be doing in a virtual network. And then you have the Azure Bastion service running. So first you have to do is just you deploy the Azure Bastion service, and it's deployed per virtual network. And it has like a public IP address and everything, and you connect to it, and then you're able to connect to your private VM. And if it's Windows, it's RDP. If it's Linux, it's SSH. So anyway, the Azure Bastion service needs to be on a separate subnet, and the subnet needs to be called Azure Bastion subnet. And so that's the overview of Azure Bastion.